Hey, small groups, open up your Bible to Mark chapter 14. Today we're going to be covering verses 27 to 31, and then we're going to be skipping to verses 66 to 71 because this is the story of how Jesus kept Peter on mission. Today, we're going to be looking at the story of Peter's betrayal of Jesus, which is a classic example of mission drift in the Bible. Remember, Jesus had called Peter to make disciples, but now his commitment was in question. Before we get into Mark 14 today, why don't you pause and read Mark chapter 1, verses 16 to 18, which is where Jesus first called Peter to follow him. Now, Jesus didn't panic when his disciples' faith faltered in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus stayed on mission and he knew that eventually his disciples would as well. Pause and read verses 27 and 28 in Mark 14. Peter learned what most believers have experienced. It's one thing to be bold when you're surrounded by believers, it's another thing to stay on mission when the world is against you. Read those verses on the screen that you see there and notice how Peter was really confident with Jesus, but then not so confident when he was on the hot seat. Here's the main takeaway. Jesus' reunion with the disciples in Galilee was just as assured as their denial after Gethsemane. And that's because staying on mission with Jesus is less about the quality of your faith and more about the power of God's grace. Go ahead and read those verses from Luke chapter 22, which provide great context for today's story from Mark 14. So here's the question now that you're going to be talking about with your small group. Have you ever experienced mission drift as a follower of Jesus? Now, remember, if you haven't already, make sure to listen to the full audio podcast to get the most out of today's discussion.